Hello student, how are you all?
Going to study about the Age of Chaucer, that is from 1340 to 1400. The Age of Chaucer. Geoffrey Chaucer was born in the reign of Edward III, lived through that of Richard II, and died the year after Henry IV ascended the throne. His life thus covers a period of glaring social contrasts and rapid political change. Edward's reign marked the highest development of medieval civilization in England. It was also the midsummer of English chivalry. The spirit of his court was that of the romantic idealism which fills Chaucer's own Knight's Tale. The story of his successive wars with France and of the famous victories of Crécy and Poitiers, as written in the Chronicle of Froissart, reads more like a brilliant novel than a piece of sober history. Strong in its newly established unity, England went forth on its career of foreign conquest in a mood of buoyant courage, and every fresh triumph served to give further stimulus to national ambition and pride. But there was another side to this picture. The king and his nobility led a very gay and debonair life. Trade expanded, and among the commercial classes wealth increased. But the masses of the people were meanwhile sunk in a condition of deplorable misery. Pestilence after pestilence ravaged the land, and then in 1348-49 came the awful pandemic called the Black Death, which in a single year swept away more than a third of the entire population, in which reappeared in 1362, 1607 and 70. Famine followed, plague, vagrants and thieves multiplied. Tyrannous laws passed to regulate labor only made bad matters worse. The French wars, which had given temporary glory to the arms of Edward, were fraught with disastrous consequences for his successor. Their enormous cost had to be met by heavy burden of taxation, which were the immediate cause of a general rising of the common folk under White Taylor, Jack Straw, and the unfrocked priest John Ball. Thou soon quelled. This was a sign of widespread social unrest. Political troubles also grew apace under Richard's unwise and despotic rule, and the constitutional conflict between the king and his subjects resulted in endless discord and confusion. The temper of the England of Chaucer's closing year was therefore very different from that of the England into which he had been born. Much of the glamour had gone from life, and the men were more conscious of its stern realities. Among the causes which generally contributed to the increasing evils of Chaucer's age, we must also reckon the corruption of the church. Of spiritual zeal and energy, very little was now left in the country. The greater prelates heaped up wealth and lived a godless and worldly way. The rank and the file of the clergy were ignorant and careless. The mendicants, farriers were notorious for their greed and profligacy. Chaucer himself, as we shall presently have to note, took little serious interest in the social reform. At the portraits which he draws for us of the fat, pleasure-loving monk, the merry and wanton farrier, and that clever rogue, the pardoner who wanders about hawking indulgence and relics, shows that he was alive to the shocking state of things which existed in the religious world of his time. It is at this point that we recognize the importance of the work of John Wycliffe about 1320-24, the morning star of the Reformation. The earnest and intrepid man gave the best of his life to the great task of reviving spiritual Christianity in England. And in the carrying out of his mission, he wrote religious pamphlets, sent his poor priests or itinerants preachers far and wide with the message of gospel, and with the help of his disciples produced a complete English version of Bible, the first translation of the scripture into any modern vernacular tongue. Social unrest and the beginning of a new religious movement were thus to the chief active forces in the England of the later 14th century. A third in influence, which did much to change the current of intellectual interest and thus affected literature very directly, came from the learning. Thus far, scholarship had been largely the concern of the church. The man's thought and feeling about themselves and the world had been governed almost entirely by theology, ecclesiastical ideas, and the medieval habit of mind were still the controlling element in Chaucer's period, but their sway was now to some extent broken by the influx of a fresh and very different spirit. That spirit had risen in Italy, chiefly from a renewed study of the literature of classic antiquity and from the consequent awakening of enthusiasm not only for the art but also for the moral ideas of Greece and Roman. An enormous impetus was thus given to intellectual expansion, and the men efforts to liberate themselves from theology trammels. The leader of this great revival were of two celebrated Italian writers, Petrarch 1304 to 1704 and Boccaccio 1330 to 75, and it was through their work in the man that the influence of humanism, as the new culture came to be called, passed into England, where its effects was soon shown in an quickened sense of beauty, the delight in life, and the free secular spirit which began to appear in our literature. It is here that we mark the rise of the vast and complex movement which was presently to culminate in the Renaissance, and of which we shall have much more to say later. We shall indeed learn that in England adverse conditions long held this movement in check, and that as in the field of religious activity, so in that of intellectual activity, this country had to wait till the 16th century before the promises of the 14th were fulfilled. But though of little power as yet, humanism has to be included among the formative influence of the literature of Chaucer's age. Now, about the Chaucer's life. Geoffrey Chaucer, who is so much the greatest figure in English literature of the 14th century that he has thrown all his contemporaries completely into the shade, was born about 1314 in London, where his father did a flourishing business as a merchant vintner. We know practically nothing about his childhood, but it is evident from the wide and varied scholarships which characterizes his writing, and he must have enjoyed the advantage of a liberal education. At 17, he received a court appointment as page to the wife of Duke of Clarence, Edward III's son. In 1359, he was with the English army in France, where he was taken prisoner, but he was soon ransomed and returned to England. Some time after this, he married and became valet of King's Chamber. From that time onward, he was for many years closely connected with the court. He was often entrusted with diplomatic missions on the continent, two of them being to Italy. He was thus brought into direct touch with Italian culture in the days of the early Renaissance, and may even have met Petrarch and Boccaccio, to the former of whom he makes pointed reference in the prologue to the Clerk's Tale. During these years, he received many marks of royal favour, and for a time sat in Parliament as Knight of the Shire of Kent. But after the overthrow of Lancastrian party and the banishment of his special patron John of Gaunt, he fell on evil days, and with approaching age felt the actual pinch of poverty. Fortunately, on the accession of John of Gaunt's son Henry IV, things mended with him, and the grant of a royal pension at once placed him beyond want and anxiety. At Christmas 1399, he took a long lease of a house at Westminster, which suggests that he still looked forward to many years of life. But he died before the next year was out, and was buried in that part of Westminster Abbey which afterwards came to known as the Poets' Corner. In studying Chaucer's work, it is important to remember that his education as a poet was twofold. Part of it came from literature, but part of it came from life. He was a thorough student, and in one of his autobiography passage in the House of Fame, he tells us how after a long day over his account, he would go home at night and there pore over his beloved volumes till he was completely dazed. But he was not a mere bookman, nor was he in the list of visionary like Shakespeare and Milton. He was, on the contrary, of a man of the world and of affairs. He had travelled much, he had seen life. His business at work, home and abroad brought him into intimate relationship with people of all sorts, and with his quick insight into character and his keen eye for everything dramatic and picturesque had humorous, he was precisely the kind of poet to profit by such varied experience. There is much that is purely bookish in his writing, but in the best of them we are always aware that he is not merely drawing upon what he was read, but that his genius is being fed his life, his wide and keep but that his genius is being fed by his wide and deep knowledge of itself. Chaucer's work in general. It is usual and convenient to divide Chaucer's literary career into three periods, which are called his French, his Italian and his English period respectively. His genius was nourished, to begin with, on the French poetry and romance, which formed the favorite reading of the court and cultivated society during the time of his youth. Naturally, he followed the fashion, and his early work was done on French models. Thus, beside translating portion at least of the poem Popular Roman de la Rose, he wrote, among other quite imitative things, an allegory on the death of Blanche, John of Gaunt's wife, which he called the Book of the Duchess, 1369, and which is wholly in manner of the reigning French school. Then, almost certainly as a direct result of his visit to Italy, French influences disappear and Italian influences take their place. In this second period, 1370 to 84, Chaucer is the disciple of great Italian master of the House of Fame. Clearly owes much to Dante, while Troilus and Criseyde, by far his longest single poem, is based upon, and in the part translated from Boccaccio, Philostrato, to close of this period, an unfinished legend of good women may also be referred. Finally, thus ceases to be Italian as he had ceased to be French and become English. This does not mean that he no longer draws freely upon French and Italian material. He continues to do this to the end. It simply means that instead of being merely imitative, he becomes independent, relying upon himself entirely, even for the use of to which he puts his borrowed themes. To this last period belong, together with sundry minor poems and contemporary tales, in which we have Chaucer's most famous and most characteristic work, Contemporary Tales. These are a collection of stories fitted into a general framework which served to hold them together. Some of them were certainly written earlier and before the frame had been thought of, but we put the tales as a whole into Chaucer's third period because it was then that most of them were composed and that the complete design shaped itself in the poet's mind. That design explains the title. A number of pilgrims on the eve of their departure meet at the Tabard Inn in Southwark, where, as it chances, Chaucer himself is also staying, and as he too be bent on the same errand, he is easily persuaded to join the party. Pilgrimages were very popular in the 14th century. They were often undertaken as here in companies, partly for the sake of society by the way and partly because of dangers of the roads. And it must be admitted their prevailing spirit was anything but severely devotional. Sometimes the pilgrims went as Chaucer's wife of Bath had already done, as far afield as Roman and Jerusalem. But one of the favorite expedition nearer home was to the shrine of the murdered son Thomas a Becket at Contemporary, and thither these particular pilgrims are bound. The jolly host of the Tabard, Harry Bailey, gives them hearty welcome and a supper of his best good victual and strong drink to match, and after they are satisfied he makes this proposal, that to beguile the tedium of the journey, each member of the party shall tell 2 tales on the way to Contemporary and 2 on the way back, and he himself shall be the judge, and that the one who tells the best tale shall be treated by all the rest to a supper on their return to the Tabat Inn. The suggestion is applauded, and these contemporary tales are the result. All this is explained in the prologue, after which Chaucer proceeds to introduce his fellow pilgrim. Though limited that we may broadly call the middle classes, the company is still very comprehensive. The military profession is represented by knight, a squire, and a yeoman; the ecclesiastical by the priors, a nun, her secretary, a monk, a farrier, a summoner of those charged under the jurisdiction of the ecclesiastical court, a pardoner or a seller of pardons, a poor parson, and a clerk of Oxford who is a student of divinity. Then we have a lawyer and a physician, and running down the social scale a number of miscellaneous characters whom one cannot well classify: a franklin, freeholder of land, a merchant and a shipman sailor, a miller, a cook, a municipal, a caterer for the colleges, a reeve, land steward, a haberdasher, a carpenter, a weaver, a dyer, a typeser, tapestry maker, a ploughman, the poor parson's brother, and a well-to-do West Country cloth maker named Alison, who, however, is better known as the wife of Bath. In his descriptions of the most prominent of these people, Chaucer's powers are shown at their very highest, and this prologue is a masterpiece of insight, sureness of touch, fine discrimination, and subtle humor. All the characters are individual, and their thoroughly typical quality gives unique value to Chaucer's picture of man and manners in the England of his time. As according to the program, each of the pilgrims was to have told 4 stories. The poet's plan was a very large one. He lived to complete a small portion only, for the work as we have it is merely a fragment of 24 tales. Yet even as it stands, its interest is wonderfully varied, for Chaucer is guided by a sense of dramatic propriety, and so the tales differ in character as widely as do those by whom they are told. Thus, to take extreme examples, we have the chivalrous epic of the knight and the clerk's beautiful account of the peasant Grisendal's wife, devotion balanced in strange contrast by the coarse farcical stories of Miller and the Reeve. It should be noted that in no case are the tales original in theme. Chaucer takes his raw material from many different sources, and the range of his reading and his quick eye for anything and everything which would serve his purpose wherever he found it are shown by the fact that he lays all sorts of literature learned and popular Latin, French and Italian under contribution, but whatever he borrows he makes entirely his own, and he remains one of the most delightful of our storytellers in verse. His finest work as narrative poet is Knight's Tale, which in accordance with the law of dramatic propriety is heroic in subject, chivalrous in sentiment and romantic in tone. Based on the tragedy of Boccaccio, it tells of 2 young cousins of royal blood named Plamon and Arcite, who when Duke Theseus makes war against their city of Thebes are taken captive by him and imprisoned in a tower of his palace. From their window one May morning they chance to see Emily, the beautiful sister of the Duke's wife, walking in the garden beneath, whereupon their lifelong friendship is shattered in an instant and they became rivals in love. Arcite is presently ransomed but unable to endure banishment from Emily, returns to Athens in disguise and finds a menial place in the Duke's service. Then, after several years, Palamon makes his escape. The cousins meet in duel, but are surprised and interrupted by the Duke and his train as they ride out to hunt. Theseus dooms them both to death on the spot, but relenting on the petition of the ladies, spares their lives on condition that each shall collect 100 knights, and that the ease and the case shall be decided in a great tournament, the hand of Emily being the victor's prize. In this tournament Arcite falls, and the story ends with the nuptial Palamon and Emily. Brilliant in itself, this fine tale is also intensely interesting as the embodiment of that romantic spirit which, as we have seen, reveled in the court circles of Chaucer's youth. Nominally, it is a tale of heroic age of Greece, but as yet no notion existed of what we call historic truth, and everything in it, character, sentiment, setting, and medievalism, it is in fact an idealized picture of the vast vanishing Middle Ages, and is steeped in the atmosphere of chivalry. Its account of the tournament, its presentation of the principle of knight ethics, and the vividness with which it portrays the chivalrous conception of love are among the features of it which we should especially note in studying it from the historical point of view. General characteristics of Chaucer's poetry. Chaucer was not in any sense of a poet of people. He was a court poet who wrote for cultured readers and a refined society. The great vital issues of the day never inspired his verse. He made his appeal to an audience composed of the favored few who wanted to be amused by comedy, or touched by pathos, or moved by romantic sentiment, but who did not wish to be disturbed by painful reminders of plague, famines, and popular discontent. Thus, though he holds the mirror up to the life of his time, the dark underside of it is nowhere reflected by him. It is significant that his only mention of the peasants' revolt is in the form of humorous reference in the non-priest tale of the cock and the fox. It is true that we have seen he felt the religious corruption of the world about him, and not only his satiric portraits of unworthy churchmen to which I have referred, but also his beautiful companion study of the poor parson, who was indeed no hireling but a real shepherd, show his sympathy in a general way with some of Wycliffe's ideas. But on the whole, he left burning questions alone. His was an essay, easy-going, genial, tolerant nature, and nothing of a reformer went to its composition. The serious note is indeed sometimes heard in his poetry, as when, for example, he writes that the scent received in Buxomenes, the restless of this wall, asked a fall, where is no home, here is but wilderness. Font pilgrim forth best out of thy style, look upon high and thank God of all. But this is not its characteristic tone. Its characteristic tone is that the frank pleasure in the good things of life. Chaucer's temperament thus explains his relationships with his age. Little touched by its religious or social movement, he responded readily to the influence of Italian humanism, and it is through him that its free secular spirit first expressed itself in our poetry. If Wycliffe was the morning star of the Reformation, Chaucer may be called the morning star of the Renaissance. A special charming feature of his poetry is its fresh outdoors atmosphere. His description of the country are often indeed in the conventional manner of his time, and his garden landscape and many flowers are to some extent things of tradition only. but he has a real love of nature and particularly of the spring, and when he writes of these as the prologue and the nightingale, the personal accent is unmistakable, that we cheerful home best. We have already spoken of Chaucer's importance in the history of our language. His 14th century or Middle English looks very difficult at first, but only a little time and perseverance are needed to master it, and this will be implied repaired by the pleasure we are sure to find the felicity of his diction and the melody of his verse. It will be observed that he amends altogether the Old English irregular lines and alliteration, rim ram rough, as he jestingly calls it, and adopts the French method of regular meter and in rhyme. Under his influence, rhyme gradually displaced alliteration in poetry. Prose of Chaucer's age. Under this head, there is little to record. Chaucer's own few prose writings, such as his translation of Boethius and his treatise on the astrolabe, are not important. Wycliffe Bible is an interesting example of vigorous, artless English, and his controversial pamphlets help to show the capabilities of the vernacular at a time when Latin was deemed the only fitting vehicle for theological discussion. But the great prose work of this period is a singular volume which goes by the title of Travel of Sir John Mandeville. According to the specific statement of the preface, this Mandeville was born at St. Albans and set out on his journey in 1322, and his book purports to give a circumstantial account of what he had seen and heard during many years of wandering in the Holy Land and the Far East. It is now established, however, that no such person as the alleged author ever existed, that the work is translation from the French of a certain Jean de Bourgogne, and that instead of being a genuine record of travel, it is simply a compilation of fabulous stories out of Pliny, Ferrier, Odoric, Marco Polo, and other retailers of the marvelous. The fact that the supposed Mandeville described a third which could carry an elephant away in its claws, a phoenix, and a weeping crocodile, a valley in which devils were jumping about like grasshoppers, and rocks of adamant which drew the nails out of passing ships, will show that this book is at least amusing, while even though it is only a translation, it keeps its place as the first English prose classic. Table of the Chaucer's age.